Okay, today I'm going to be talking about my Nikon D7200 DSLR camera, and in particular, making this video kind of in response to an annoyance that I had with it. Everything works as it should, as it's designed to. There's no annoyance with functionality. I love the camera, the whole, just love it. Highly recommended the whole thing. I made this video to explain something that the folks at the camera shop were not able to explain to me regarding exposure compensation. And it took me some time to figure out what was really going on. So I figured if I had this issue, and I'll explain the issue in a minute, if I had this issue, other people might be having it or might be curious about it and would like an explanation. So what I'm first going to do is using my handheld digital camcorder here, and I didn't really write a script. I'm kind of doing this off the cuff. And I'm not going to do any editing. The videos I make, if I have to write a script, if I have to make a professional, if I have to edit them, then I'm not going to make the video. So that's just the way it goes. It's not. You have to forgive the quality here. I'm just going to sort of wing it as I go. So first, let me frame the problem. Not the problem. It's not a problem. I shouldn't say problem. It's a characteristic of the camera that to me needs a little explanation. But granted, I'm an engineer type, so I need to know things that I don't fully understand or don't know really bug the shit out of me. So until I fully understand them inside and out and know why they do what they do, then it annoys me. And this, by the way, this issue very well may be something that professionals completely understand. And maybe everyone knows this, but I don't. By the way, I'm new to photography. This is a new DSLR. I haven't. The last SLR I purchased was in the early to mid '90s. It was a Canon Rebel 35mm film camera. Probably purchased it in 1992. I'm new to digital photography other than my camcorder, and having to reacquaint myself with all of these features, and especially a lot of the high-tech features on the Nikon D7200. So first, let me frame the problem or the characteristic. Now, I'm going to set the camera to auto. And I am going to hold the camera here. I hope that this picks it up. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is the exposure compensation, which is this little button right there. This button versus the exposure indicator or the exposure meter. So, what happens to the meter when I actually use exposure compensation? So, if I was to hold down exposure compensation and try to adjust it in full auto, nothing happens. And that makes sense, right? In full auto, it's fully automatic. I don't have control over aperture, shutter speed, ISO, nothing. It's fully automatic. Okay, so I want to start there just to show you nothing happens. Now, let me switch over to one of the semi-automatic modes, such as aperture priority, which I'm a fan of. It could very well be shutter priority, but aperture priority will be just fine for the explanation. So, now, here is my exposure meter with the blinking 0. Whatever you want to call it. To me, it's a meter. I don't know if you want to call it an exposure indicator or exposure meter, but it's this thing right here, this display that we're going to be talking about. So now I'm in aperture priority, and the way this should work, and it will work, is if I adjust. On the front, if I adjust the f-stop, the camera will automatically adjust the shutter speed to maintain exposure. And as you can see, the exposure meter doesn't move because I'm adjusting the aperture right now only, and the camera is automatically adjusting shutter speed to maintain proper exposure. ISO is currently at 640. I think I have that on manual ISO. And I'm going to switch that around in the middle, but in a minute. But anyway, okay, so let's go back. So that's the way it should work, right? Now, let's say I'm still on aperture priority, and I'm going to hold down the exposure compensation button, and with the back wheel, I'm going to start adjusting. Okay, so I was properly exposed in the middle, and now I've added a third of a stop, and look at the meter. The meter goes up. 2/3 of a stop, the meter goes up. 1 full stop, the meter indicates a positive exposure. So let me go back down to 0. Okay, I'm going to snap a photo, and I'm looking at a wall basically, intentionally, just so there's no clutter there. Okay, so that was what it looked like. Let me do the exposure compensation and go up 2 full stops. There we go. The meter shows, and the indicator shows a +2, 2 full stops. Okay, there it is. Let me snap some photos. And it's brighter. It's washed out, right? Let me do the opposite. And again, this is not the issue I want to talk about. I'm just framing the issue here. It's showing you, explaining how the meter is supposed to work. Okay? Let me go down, to make it really dramatic, a -4. Stops in the exposure compensation. Snap a couple of photos. And, well, there it is. You can't see anything. Let me, see, it's really dark. Let me bring that back up. Exposure compensation, -2. See, really dark. Okay, so it works, as it should. That's not the weird part. The weird part is when, now, you know what I want to do? Let me go to shutter priority and show the same thing. I'll just do this a little quicker. So in shutter priority, let me zero out the exposure compensation, and we can see in shutter priorities I changed shutter speed, f-stop changes to maintain proper exposure. Now if I go to exposure compensation right here and I start playing with it, you can see what's happening. I go positive, and you can see it's becoming overexposed. And look at the meter. The meter goes negative. No problem. It's doing what it's supposed to do. Now, here's the interesting part. This is probably perfectly normal to most people, but this is the part that really blew my mind, So now I'm on M for manual. This is fully manual operation now. I'm in charge of everything. Now, let me say that I've set my ISO at 640. I'm not on auto ISO, so my ISO is fixed at 640. And you can see with my current settings, I'm slightly overexposed by almost by 2/3 of a stop. So I'll change my shutter speed to 1/60th, and now you can see I am properly exposed. Let me snap a photo. There's the wall. It's just fine. Now, let me go back, and now I'm going to hit the exposure compensation button, and I'm going to go positive. So look at the numbers on the left. They're going positive, but look at the meter. The meter is now going negative. The meter is going the opposite way that it did in shutter priority or aperture priority. Now let me take the exposure compensation and go negative, but look at the meter. The meter is going positive. That's weird. That's what no one could explain to me. I looked in the manual. I couldn't figure it out. The manual didn't really help. If I missed something, I missed something. But I looked all over the manual and the operator's manual, and I couldn't find it. Now, just to contrast, let me go back to aperture priority. Okay, I'm now back to aperture priority, and watch. I'm going to hit exposure compensation. As I go positive, the meter goes positive, right? Like it should. It's telling me that I'm overexposed. As I go negative, the meter goes negative. Okay? Let me go back to manual. Now I'm on manual. Exposure compensation. I go positive. See the positive 0.7 plus 1. Meter goes negative. I go negative, meter go. What is up with that? That's weird. Well, here's what's up with that. In order to understand what's going on, I'm going to go back to aperture priority just to demonstrate once again what's actually happening here. In aperture priority, I'm in control of the aperture. The camera will adjust everything else to maintain exposure, right? Okay, so when I press exposure compensation and I start going positive, and the meter goes positive, look what it's doing. It's changing the shutter speed to allow a longer exposure. Thus, the exposure meter is going positive. See? If I go negative with exposure compensation, it's changing to a faster shutter speed, and the meter indicates an underexposure. Okay, we're in aperture priority. This is the way things are supposed to work. Now, let me go back to manual. Now I'm back on manual. Here's what's happening. Okay, I've already outlined the weirdness. Okay, when I touch exposure compensation, let's just say I want to, let me snap a photo here. Everything looks normal. Okay, I want the wall. Let's say I want the wall a little more exposed. So now there's a couple ways I can do that. I mean, of course, I could just change manually the, I can change manually the shutter speed, like down to 1/30th, and snap a photo, and it's going to be more washed out. Okay, let me go back to the middle. Now, here's what exposure compensation is doing. Let's say I want to take a whole mess of photos. For the whole photo session, I want to be slightly overexposed for whatever reason. But I want my meter, even though I'm overexposed, I want my meter, to read dead center, so that all the adjustments I make, whether they're f-stops or aperture, still read 0, even though I'm overexposed. Okay, so what we're doing here, and this only applies to manual mode, is when I hit exposure compensation, and let's say I dial in positive 1. Okay, positive 1. My meter went, look at my meter, it went negative. It went to a negative 1. Stop. Okay? So what I have to do, what I've effectively done is I've tuned the meter to read low. So now I have to manually dial back, and I'm going to use shutter speed, dial back my shutter speed to bring the meter back to 0. So I'm tricking the camera. Right now, the camera thinks the exposure is proper because the meter is reading 0, but in reality, it's overexposed by a full stop because I have skewed or adjusted the meter. That's what's going on. Okay, so let's take a photo. Okay. And there's my slightly overexposed. Let me make this really dramatic and show you. So let me go back and repeat this one more time. And let me zero out my exposure compensation and start from scratch. Okay, let me try this one more time. Okay. Now, we are in manual mode, and I'm going to dial in a properly exposed photo. Okay, it happens to be, in this case, my ISO is fixed here, by the way, 640. I've just determined I want 640 for whatever reason. I've dialed in 1/60th shutter speed, and I've dialed in f5.6 for aperture. And you can see from my meter, I have a properly exposed picture. Let me take a picture. There it is. That's the wall. Looks good. Now, again, for whatever reason, I want my photos to be overexposed. Let me say overexposed by 3 full stops, which is ridiculous. But for whatever reason, I want them overexposed by 3 full stops. But I want, because I don't want that meter to throw me off for my photo shoot, I want the meter to read 0 as being properly exposed. Okay, so let me go 1, 2, look, there's 3 full stops, okay? And I've done it by adjusting the shutter speed, and the meter properly reads, okay? 3, let me take a picture. Look at that, way washed out, right? Okay, I could continue shooting happily ever after, just like this, with that meter reading 3 stops overexposed, right? But, you know, let's say that because I want this to be the norm for the photo shoot, the norm, then I want my meter to read 0, even though we are overexposed. So what we can do is press exposure compensation and dial in a +3. See, now look what it's doing. It's bringing that meter from 3 as I'm dialing in a plus, blah, 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 +3. Look, at +3, it brought it down to 0. So basically, in manual mode only, exposure compensation is doing nothing except offsetting the exposure meter. That's it. That's all it's doing. And that's why the apparent backwardsness of the exposure compensation versus the reading when you're in manual. I hope that makes sense. Now, one other interesting thing about exposure compensation in manual mode. Now, this shift gears now. Let me take, this is a sort of a different fact here, but let me take this back to a starting point again with 0 exposure compensation, and let me get a good setting here. Okay, so we're in manual mode. All right. Now I'm in manual mode with fixed ISO. What I can do is I can turn on, I'm just going to do this one hand. I don't think I can do it. I want to turn on automatic ISO. I'm going to have to set the camera down for that. Hold on a second. I want to turn on auto ISO. Okay. Now, in manual mode, but you can see we now have auto ISO. Okay, so we have a perfectly correctly exposed situation here in manual, and I'm going to take a photo. Boom, there it is. Okay, looks good. Now that I have auto ISO on, my exposure compensation button does something entirely different. I'm going to press exposure compensation, and I'm going to start going positive. Look, the meter stays 0. I'm going to start going negative. The meter stays 0, but look what it's doing. Because auto ISO is on, my exposure compensation button is effectively a button that changes ISO to compensate. Oh, it's basically a button to change ISO. That's what it's doing. There we go. So it's just changing. There we go. It's just changing ISO. So 280, 320. Let's get a photo. Looks a little dark there. And let me go back. And okay, I should say the photo I just took was with a -1. Okay, so the exposure compensation is down -1 stop, and it did it by affecting the ISO, by changing the ISO. Let me go to +2 to make it really dramatic, maybe +3. So you can see the ISO went up. We're at a +3 compensation, and look at that, way washed out. So, in summary, when you're in a manual mode and you're in manually selected ISO, your exposure compensation button is only a meter offset. That's all it is. It doesn't affect any settings at all. It's a meter offset. It's to bring your meter, it's to zero out your meter for proper exposure, basically, for your particular shoot. However, when you're in manual mode, but when you're in auto ISO, the exposure compensation actually does something. It actually compensates for exposure Okay, but it does it by changing the ISO. So let me go back to 0. Okay, this should be our perfect scenario right here. Nice picture. Let's say I want it much darker for whatever reason. Okay, so I press my exposure compensation button and I start going negative, and look what's happening. Well, the ISO is going down. Okay, I now have -2, and the ISO went down to 160. Even though the meter is zeroed out, we're going to get an underexposed photo by -2 stops. Let me take a photo and you can see. Boom, there it is. Okay, so that is what's going on. That's the weirdness of the exposure compensation meter in manual mode. This probably applies to other Nikon cameras other than the D7200. I wouldn't doubt it a bit. I'm sure it applies to the D7100 and probably others. Maybe it's a Nikon thing. Maybe other camera manufacturers do this too. I don't know. I'm an amateur basically at this, but because I discovered this thing this characteristic that I couldn't find readily available information on, I thought I'd make a video to help out. Sorry for the zero editing here and the handheld camera, but again, I wouldn't make the video if I had to spend time doing it. So I hope this helps. Enjoy. Ciao.